First shows that I worked was down here, man, around Houston. I worked Houston, they asked me to do it, and I was anxious to do some live appearances.
While Elvis Presley's management showed the world a superstar who seemed to have it all, private pictures were capturing moments the public was never meant to see. Quiet, unsettling, and sometimes heartbreaking moments that reveal a very different side of the king. What did these long hidden pictures actually capture? This is the story of the hidden side of Elvis Presley's life. The pictures that had fans looking twice. Elvis Presley was the first anointed king of rock and roll. And if you grew up in the 1950s or 1960s, chances are you knew exactly who he was. By the time he became a major star in the mid-1950s, he was no longer just another singer trying to make a name for himself. Elvis had become a cultural icon, and almost everything about him seemed to catch people's attention. His voice sounded different, his clothes stood out, and even the way he performed on stage had people talking. Before long, millions of fans were buying his records, watching his movies, and following his every move. Yet, the unsettling thing was, the more people saw of Elvis, the more curious they became about the parts of his life they never got to see. You see, Elvis spent most of his adult life in front of cameras, but there was still a lot about him that people never really knew. In fact, the more successful he became, the more mysterious his personal life seemed, and that only made people want to know more. Who was he when the stage lights went off? What was his private life really like? And was the man fans saw on television really the same man they would meet away from the spotlight? Those questions only became louder after Elvis passed away. Some people questioned what had really happened during his final years, while others went as far as speculating about whether Elvis had actually passed away at all. Before long, supposed Elvis sightings were popping up everywhere, with people claiming they had seen him in places nobody expected. It just showed that when it came to the king, there were always going to be theories and mysteries surrounding him. More than anything, those stories showed just how difficult it was for many fans to accept that the king was truly gone. Now, after so many years, you would expect that intrigue and fascination to slowly fade away. But in the king's case, the opposite happened. Every now and then, a new picture of Elvis surfaces and gets people talking all over again. Sometimes, it is a moment most fans have never seen before. Other times, it is simply Elvis looking completely different from the polished superstar everyone remembers. Either way, these pictures make fans wonder what was happening outside the version of his life the public was used to seeing. And despite Elvis living most of his life surrounded by cameras, not every moment became part of the Elvis Presley story we were shown. There were private gatherings, silent days, and ordinary moments that were captured without the carefully planned look of his famous publicity pictures. Some of those hidden pictures now give fans a chance to see Elvis from a completely different angle. And that is where things start getting interesting. So, what do these pictures actually reveal about the king? What was happening around him when he was not performing for millions of people? And what might these moments tell us about the man behind the legend? Well, before we get into those pictures, we need to go back to the beginning. Long before the fame, the money, and the constant attention, Elvis was simply a young boy growing up in Mississippi with no idea that he would one day become a superstar. The humble roots and the spark of inspiration. Now, long before anyone called him the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley was just a boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, growing up in a family that did not have much money. Born in 1935, Elvis knew what it meant to see his parents struggle to make ends meet. His father, Vernon, took whatever work he could find, and the family lived in a small house that Vernon helped build. Life was simple, and money was often tight. But Elvis was already growing up with something that would eventually change everything: a deep love for music. This love became even stronger when the family moved to Memphis in 1948. Elvis was only 13, but Memphis was the kind of place where music seemed to be everywhere. He heard gospel in church, country music on the radio, and blues coming from different parts of the city. Elvis listened to all of it. He was calm and a little shy, but when it came to music, he was paying close attention. He was taking in sounds from different places, and without even realizing it, starting to build a style of his own. At the same time, Elvis was beginning to look different from the other teenagers around him. He wore his hair longer, combed it back with pomade, and chose clothes that made him stand out. Some people thought his style was strange, but Elvis did not seem too bothered by it. He was simply becoming more comfortable with who he was, and music was becoming a bigger part of that identity. This confidence eventually led him to Sun Records in 1953, shortly after he finished high school. Elvis was 18 when he walked into the Memphis studio and paid to make a recording, reportedly as a gift for his mother, Gladys. The studio belonged to Sam Phillips, a producer who was looking for a new kind of sound. Phillips wanted someone who could bring the energy of blues to a much wider audience, and Elvis would soon give him exactly what he had been looking for. Still, nothing happened overnight. Elvis recorded at Sun Records, but there was no instant success. Then, in July 1954, he was working with guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black when the session suddenly took an unexpected turn. After struggling through a few songs, Elvis started fooling around with an old blues song called "That's All Right." Scotty and Bill joined him, and almost immediately, the whole mood in the room changed. Sam Phillips heard the sound and knew there was something there. When "That's All Right" reached a local radio station, listeners started calling because they wanted to know who was singing. Soon, Elvis was performing around Memphis and other parts of the South, and people were paying just as much attention to the way he moved as they were to his music. Young fans loved it, while some older listeners thought he was too wild. Either way, Elvis had people talking, and that was exactly what a rising star needed. By 1955, Elvis was becoming a much bigger name, and a man named Colonel Tom Parker was starting to play an important role in his career. Parker was an experienced music promoter and manager who saw just how much potential Elvis had. Later that year, he helped arrange Elvis's move from Sun Records to Radio Corporation of America, better known as RCA. The deal gave Elvis access to a much bigger record label and a national audience, and from that point on, his career was about to move at a completely different speed. Songs like Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog, and Don't Be Cruel turned him into a national sensation. His television appearances brought him into millions of homes, teenagers couldn't get enough of him, and parents were trying to figure out what all the excitement was about. Within a few years, the boy who had grown up with very little had become one of the most famous entertainers in America. By the time Elvis entered the United States Army in 1958, the quiet teenager from Tupelo was almost unrecognizable compared with the superstar he had become. He had the fame, the money, and millions of people watching his every move. But the more famous Elvis became, the less ordinary his life could be. And the next chapter would show just how much that fame was about to change him. The comeback that came with a price. When Elvis returned home from the Army in 1960, most people expected him to go straight back to the stage. After all, he was still one of the biggest stars in the world, and his fans had been waiting for him. But Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, had a different idea. Parker believed Hollywood could make Elvis a lot of money without the cost and stress of constant touring, so instead of sending him back on the road, he started pushing him toward movies. At first, everything seemed fine. Elvis was making one movie after another, and audiences knew what they were going to get. There would be a beautiful location, a love story, plenty of songs, and Elvis playing the charming guy who somehow found himself in the middle of everything. Movies like Blue Hawaii and Viva Las Vegas did well, and the soundtracks made even more money. Elvis was also living a life most people could only dream about, with expensive cars, huge homes, plenty of money, and a close group of friends and associates who became known as the Memphis Mafia. From the outside, it looked perfect, but Elvis was beginning to feel like something was missing. The problem was that Elvis had become famous because he was different. In the 50s, his voice, his clothes, and the way he moved on stage had made people stop and stare. Now, he was spending much of his time making predictable movies and recording songs that did not always excite him. And while he was caught in this routine, music was changing around him. By the middle of the 1960s, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and other new artists were attracting younger fans. Elvis could see it happening, and he knew the music world was moving forward without him. He was still a huge star, but deep down, he was starting to worry that people were more interested in remembering the Elvis of the past than seeing what he could still do. By 1968, he knew he had to do something. Elvis had agreed to appear in an NBC television special, and Parker wanted it to be a simple Christmas show. The plan was for Elvis to sit comfortably, sing Christmas songs, and give viewers a safe, familiar version of the star they already knew. But director Steve Binder had a different idea, and Elvis was ready to go along with him. Instead of giving viewers another polished performance, they brought back the energy Elvis had been missing for years. He put on black leather, performed with musicians from his early days, joked with them, played music, and moved around the stage like he finally felt free again. When the special aired in December 1968, people immediately noticed something had changed. Elvis did not look like a star, trying desperately to stay relevant. He looked confident, excited, and completely in his element again. This response gave Elvis the push he needed to return to live performances. In 1969, he began his famous Las Vegas residency at the International Hotel, where he performed with a full band and orchestra. The young Elvis, who had shocked audiences in the 50s, was gone, but in his place was a more experienced performer who could move between rock, gospel, and soul, and still keep an entire room focused on him. Then, in 1973, Aloha from Hawaii, via satellite, took his performance to viewers around the world and gave his career another major moment. But while everything looked great on the outside, keeping up with this life was becoming difficult. Elvis had demanding performances in Las Vegas, followed by long tours across the country, leaving him with very little time to rest. As the pressure continued, he began relying more heavily on prescription medications, and his health started becoming a serious concern. So, the comeback that was supposed to give Elvis his freedom was slowly becoming another kind of trap. He had escaped the movies because he wanted to feel like an artist again, and for a while, he got exactly what he wanted. The crowds were still cheering, the lights were still shining, and Elvis was back on the stage where he belonged. But behind all of those sold-out shows, something was changing, and the man everyone came to see was beginning to struggle in ways most fans could not see. The final curtain, and the day the world stood still. By 1976, Elvis Presley was struggling in ways his fans could no longer completely miss. The years of touring, constant performances, health problems, and heavy use of prescription medication had taken a serious toll on him. He could still walk onto a stage and have those moments that reminded everyone why they called him the king. But getting through an entire show was becoming much harder, and even though people around him tried to keep his health problems private, the changes were becoming harder to hide. Fans who had followed Elvis for years could see that something was different. He did not always move with the same energy, and there were nights when he looked exhausted before the show was even over. But Elvis was still expected to perform, and the shows kept coming. He had contracts to fulfill, people depending on him, and thousands of fans who had paid to see him. So even as his health continued to decline, he remained on the road. By the summer of 1977, Elvis was preparing for another tour when his life suddenly came to an end. On August 16th, he was at Graceland when his fiancée, Ginger Alden, went upstairs and found him unresponsive in the bathroom of his private suite. She called for help, and paramedics rushed to the mansion, trying to revive him before taking him to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. But there was nothing more the doctors could do. Elvis sadly passed away on August 16, 1977.
Elvis Presley died here about 3:30 this afternoon. He had been found in his bathroom, unconscious, not breathing, and Elvis was declared dead at 3:30.
He was just 42 years old, and the news was almost impossible for people to believe. Elvis had spent more than 20 years becoming one of the most famous people in the world. So for many fans, it felt strange to suddenly hear that he was gone. The news spread quickly, and radio and television stations interrupted their regular programs to report his death. People began traveling to Memphis, and crowds gathered outside Graceland. They brought flowers, cried, sang his songs, and stood together trying to make sense of what had happened. For people who had grown up with Elvis, losing him felt deeply personal because his music had been part of their lives for so long. But after the funeral, the shock slowly gave way to questions. How had the young man, who once seemed unstoppable, become so unwell at just 42? What had really been happening behind the gates of Graceland? And how much of Elvis's private life had the public never seen? Those questions would keep following Elvis long after his death. And as the years passed, stories from people who knew him, personal accounts, and pictures that had never been widely seen began adding new details to the story. The more those pieces came together, the more it became clear that the Elvis fans knew from the stage was only one part of the man who lived behind the gates. The Elvis mystery nobody could let go. When Elvis Presley passed away in August 1977, a lot of people simply could not believe he was really gone. To millions of fans, Elvis had been part of their lives for years, so hearing that he had passed away at just 42 was incredibly difficult to accept. And because there were still so many questions surrounding his final years, people quickly began filling in the gaps with their own stories. Before long, it became difficult to separate what people knew from what they simply wanted to believe. One of the biggest stories was that Elvis had secretly planned his own disappearance. According to the theory, years of fame, pressure, and constant attention had finally become too much, so he supposedly faked his death and went somewhere nobody would recognize him. Other versions became even more dramatic, claiming he had entered witness protection because of dangerous business dealings. There was never reliable evidence to prove any of this, but the idea was so fascinating that people kept talking about it. And once people started believing Elvis might still be alive, almost any sighting could become part of the story. Someone would claim they saw him at a restaurant. Another person would swear they spotted him at an airport, while someone else might insist that a man who looked remarkably like Elvis had walked into a store and disappeared.
I'll go through the most well-known, starting with the earliest, in which someone claims to have seen Elvis at the Memphis International Airport on the same day he died. There's no record of a passenger, and there's no source witness.
Most of these stories had little evidence behind them, but that did not really matter. For some fans, believing Elvis was still somewhere out there was simply easier than accepting that he was gone. The tabloids quickly realized how much attention these stories could bring. Blurry pictures started appearing beside dramatic headlines claiming Elvis had been spotted in different parts of America. The pictures were often so unclear that almost any dark-haired man could have been mistaken for him, but that was exactly what made them fun to debate. People would study a face, a hairstyle, or those famous sideburns, and convince themselves they were looking at the king. Then, one particular picture took the mystery even further. It became known as the pool house photo, and it appeared to show a dark-haired man sitting inside the pool house at Graceland. For people who already believed Elvis had faked his death, this picture seemed almost perfect. Why would someone who looked so much like Elvis be sitting inside his own home after the world had been told he was gone? Just like that, a blurry photograph became another piece of the Elvis mystery. But the picture eventually had a much simpler explanation. The man was identified as Al Strada, a friend of the Presley family, rather than Elvis himself. You might think that would have ended the story, but by then, the idea had already taken on a life of its own. The belief that Elvis was secretly living somewhere had become bigger than any one photograph. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Elvis sightings became a familiar part of pop culture, appearing in movies, television shows, and comedy sketches. People joked about seeing him in diners or catching him in the background of a crowd, but underneath those jokes was something much more understandable. Millions of people had grown up with Elvis, watched his career unfold, and listened to his music for years. Saying goodbye to someone who had been such a huge part of their lives was never going to be easy. But there was something even more interesting happening while everyone was busy searching for Elvis. Real pieces of his life were still sitting out there, hidden in old collections and private archives, waiting to be seen. These were not blurry pictures of someone who supposedly looked like Elvis. They were real moments from his life, captured when he was away from the stage and the crowds. And once those pictures began coming into view, the mystery surrounding Elvis started to change. The question was no longer, could Elvis still be alive? It became something far more interesting. How much of the real Elvis had the public never seen? The pictures Elvis never meant us to see. For decades, after all the conspiracy theories and speculation surrounding Elvis, it felt like there was nothing left to discover about him. Elvis had been photographed so much that most people probably assumed there was not much left to see. But the more you look into his story, the more you realize that there were still parts of his life most fans had never seen. This becomes much clearer when you look at what is actually sitting inside the Graceland archives. Graceland says its archives contain more than 50,000 pictures, along with negatives, slides, movies, video, documents, and other material connected to Elvis's life. And only about 10% of the Elvis items in those archives are currently on display. This means the public has spent decades looking at Elvis without actually seeing most of the visual material connected to his life. And when some of that material finally comes to light, it can show us a side of the king that the famous pictures never did. One picture from 1956 makes this difference glaring. At the time, Elvis was only 21, but newspapers and magazines were already presenting him as a young star living the kind of luxurious life people associated with Hollywood millionaires. He was becoming famous. The money was coming in. And everywhere you looked, Elvis Presley was being turned into a superstar. But this long-lost, unedited, black and white photograph gives us a very calm picture of his life. Instead of seeing Elvis surrounded by fans, cars, or people treating him like a celebrity, we see him sitting alone on the steps of an Atlanta diner, eating a sandwich from a paper plate. There are no bodyguards standing around him, and no glamorous setting. He is just sitting there, eating his lunch. And this ordinary little moment becomes surprisingly powerful because it shows Elvis before the legend completely took over the person. And this is exactly what makes these hidden pictures so fascinating. The famous photographs were usually taken because Elvis was performing, promoting a record, appearing in a movie, or giving photographers the kind of image they needed. But a picture like the one outside the diner catches something else. It shows a young man in the middle of his life, without the stage lights and without the polished image that was already being built around him. And there is reason to believe there are still many more moments like that. In 2010, Graceland archivists were going through papers belonging to Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, when they found an unmarked envelope containing 3 negatives. After researching them, they determined that the negatives dated back to 1957. Then, in 2025, Fox 5 found previously unseen footage of Elvis from 1956 while searching through its own archives, and the material was later brought to Graceland. So even after all these years, pieces of Elvis's past are still turning up in places where nobody expected to find them. Somehow, this changes the way we look at the entire archive. These are not just old pictures sitting in boxes. They are pieces of a life that was photographed constantly, yet still had plenty of moments that never became part of the public story. Some show Elvis with family and friends, some capture him away from the stage, and others simply catch him doing things that were never meant to become famous. This may be the real reason these pictures matter. They do not need to prove another conspiracy or give us some shocking secret about Elvis. The most revealing thing they can do is show us the person behind the image. Because while the world was busy watching the king perform, there was still a young man sitting on diner steps, eating a simple sandwich, living moments that looked nothing like the glamorous life people imagined he was living. And when Graceland says there are more than 50,000 pictures in its archives, with only about 10% of the Elvis items currently on display, one question becomes almost impossible to ignore. If this is what one forgotten picture can reveal about the king, what other side of Elvis is still sitting somewhere in those unseen archives? The king was more than the myth. When you put aside the rumors, the tabloid stories, and all the theories that have followed Elvis Presley for decades, one thing is still clear. His impact on music was huge. Elvis was not just another successful singer. He brought together country, blues, gospel, and rhythm and blues at a time when those sounds were still seen as separate. He mixed them in a way young people had never really heard before, and suddenly, music felt different. But it was not just his music that got people talking. Elvis also changed the way a performer could look, move, and connect with the crowd. His clothes, his hair, his voice, and the way he moved on stage all became part of his appeal. Teenagers loved it, while many older people were shocked by it. But that only made more people curious about him. Elvis was no longer just someone they listened to on the radio. He was someone they wanted to see, talk about, and even copy. And the influence Elvis had did not stop with his own generation. Artists like the Beatles, Bruce Springsteen, Michael Jackson, and Prince all grew up in a world Elvis had helped shape. He showed future performers that a singer could be more than just a voice on a record. A performer could influence music, fashion, television, and even the way young people saw themselves. Behind all the money, fame, and attention, Elvis was still dealing with his own struggles. His health was getting worse, his personal life was becoming more complicated, and the pressure of being Elvis Presley never really let up. Fans saw the concerts, the costumes, and the screaming crowds, but once the lights went off, there was a much calmer side of his life that most people knew very little about. This is why the rare pictures and forgotten moments matter so much. They do not take anything away from the king. Instead, they help us see the man behind the famous name. We get to see Elvis not only as a superstar, but as a son, a father, a friend, and a man trying to live with a level of fame that most of us could never imagine. And maybe this is why people are still fascinated by Elvis nearly 50 years after his passing. His story did not end when the music stopped. Every rare picture, personal memory, and forgotten detail gives us another small piece of his life. And each piece reminds us that there was always more to Elvis than the image the world knew. So perhaps the real question is no longer whether Elvis was hiding somewhere after his death. Maybe the bigger question is whether we ever truly knew him at all. Because if a few rare pictures can still change the way we see Elvis after nearly 50 years, how much of the real man do you think the world never got to see? Share your thoughts and favorite theories in the comments below, and do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more fascinating deep dives into history's biggest mysteries.